11:47 p.m. A four-man Ukrainian reconnaissance team, 200 meters from a Russian S-400 radar array Moscow called Unbreakable. 40 minutes later, that radar was a smoking ruin, and not one Russian soldier inside the perimeter had fired a shot. This is the story of how a battery the Kremlin treated as the last word in air defense around Sevastopol, protecting what's left of the Black Sea Fleet, built to shoot down cruise missiles at 400 kilometers, got blinded by four men with rucksacks, demolition charges, and months of patience. I'm your host at War Vector, where we go through the battles that change wars. This one didn't make headlines for days. By the time it did, Russian officers were still trying to explain to Moscow how it happened at all. Stick around, because the way this operation unfolded, the dead-end months of surveillance, the storm that nearly killed it, the radar crew that almost caught them with 20 minutes to spare, tells you more about how this war is actually being fought than any press release will. Start with what the S-400 actually was, and why Russia trusted it the way it did. By late 2025, the S-400 Triumph battery on the high ground northeast of Sevastopol was the backbone of Russia's southern Crimean air defense umbrella. Each battery carried up to 12 launchers, each loaded with four 48N6 series missiles, with an engagement range out to 400 kilometers and an effective ceiling above 30 kilometers. On paper, nothing Ukraine could fly, drone, missile, or aircraft, was supposed to get near Sevastopol's harbor without that radar painting it first. That confidence is exactly what Ukrainian military intelligence, the HUR, decided to exploit. By October 2025, satellite imagery and open-source tracking from Ukrainian analysts had already mapped the rough footprint of the radar emplacement. Mapping a position from orbit and getting close enough to physically disable it are two different problems. Russian forces had reinforced the perimeter with a triple ring of security: outer patrol roads, motion sensor trip lines, and a static guard detachment rotating every 6 hours. Drone reconnaissance alone couldn't solve this. Someone had to walk in. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Sending four men against a guarded, layered air defense site, deep inside what Russia considered secure rear territory, should have been suicidal. The plan worked, because Russian commanders had grown overconfident in their own perimeter, convinced that distance from the front line meant safety. That assumption is what Ukrainian planners were counting on. We went through the declassified parts of the after-action briefing, and one detail kept nagging at us. The operation almost didn't happen. 3 months of surveillance, watching shift changes, patrol timing, radar emission patterns, and for most of that window, the team had nothing. No gap in the patrol schedule, no weak point in the fence line, just static, repetitive, frustrating watching, with no clear opening. That's obstacle one, and it nearly killed the mission before it started. The reconnaissance cell, 3 operators rotating through a hide position roughly 4 kilometers from the battery, logged patrol intervals night after night. For weeks, the Russian rotation looked airtight. Guards every 90 minutes, overlapping coverage. No blind spot longer than 6 minutes. 6 minutes isn't enough to breach a perimeter, disable a radar, and get out undetected. The team needed something closer to 20. Then, in late November, a single irregularity. A supply convoy delay pushed one guard rotation back roughly 14 minutes, 3 nights in a row. Combined with the known 6-minute blind window, that gave the team a margin just over what it needed. Barely. Ukrainian planners didn't wait for a perfect opportunity. They built the whole operation around an imperfect one, because an imperfect opportunity that exists beats a perfect one that doesn't. Which weapon do you think mattered more here? Surveillance drones, or the ground team's demolition charges? Comment your answer below. A for drones, B for explosives, C for both equally. By early December 2025, the assault element was set. 4 operators, call signs withheld in the briefing, drawn from a special operations reconnaissance unit with experience in deep infiltration along the Kherson and Zaporizhia axes. Each carried suppressed small arms for self-defense only. The plan depended on never firing a shot. 2 carried demolition charges shaped for radar electronics, not structural damage. The goal wasn't to level the site. It was to make the radar's brain useless while leaving the body intact. So Russian engineers couldn't just patch it. Put yourself in their position for a second. 4 men on foot, 4 kilometers from extraction, inside a Russian-controlled security zone, with a 6-minute window that could close on any given night for any reason. Weather, a rescheduled patrol, a guard who decides to take the long way. No backup if it goes wrong. No quick reaction force. Just the 4 of them and whatever's in their packs. Stay with me, because the next 18 minutes are the difference between a battery that protects Sevastopol's entire approach and a battery that's blind. So how do you walk 4 men past a layered Russian security cordon without tripping a single alarm? The answer involves drones, but not the kind you're picturing. In the 72 hours before the operation, a small Ukrainian reconnaissance drone, flying high enough to dodge short-range counter-drone radar, made a final pass over the site. It confirmed 2 things. The convoy delay pattern was holding, and a third complication had shown up. A new radio relay mast had gone up roughly 300 meters from the planned approach corridor, manned by what looked like a 2-person signals detachment that hadn't been there during earlier surveillance. That's obstacle 2, an unplanned change, 20 hours before insertion, putting 2 additional Russian personnel directly in the team's approach lane. Planners adjusted the route in the field instead of scrubbing the mission. The team shifted their infiltration line roughly 200 meters west, which added nearly 40 minutes to their approach, but routed them around the new relay position entirely. Less margin on the back end. Also the difference between walking past the obstacle and walking into it. 11:09 p.m., the night of the operation. The team crossed the outer perimeter trip line during the 6-minute patrol gap, moving in pairs roughly 30 meters apart, using thermal defeating cover and dead ground they'd identified during surveillance. No alarms, no radio chatter suggesting detection. By 11:31 p.m., the team had reached the inner fence line around the radar array itself, the most heavily watched ring on the entire site. Here's what most people get wrong about operations like this. They assume the hardest part is getting in. It isn't. The hardest part is staying calm enough, long enough, once you're already inside, that one mistake doesn't unravel 3 months of work in the final 90 seconds. 11:38 p.m. The demolition team reached the base of the radar's primary antenna housing, the 91 N6E acquisition and engagement radar, the part that actually tracks and guides missiles to target. Without it, all 12 of the battery's launchers are effectively blind. You can have every missile in the world loaded and ready. If the radar can't see the target, nothing fires accurately. The team placed charges on 3 points: the primary waveguide assembly, the cooling system regulating the high-power transmitter, and the data cable junction feeding target information to the fire control van roughly 40 meters away. 3 points, 3 separate failure modes, built so that even a partial detonation would put the system out of action for weeks. 11:44 p.m. With charges set and the team starting to withdraw toward the breach point, a Russian guard on routine foot patrol changed his route, 3 minutes ahead of schedule. That's obstacle 3, and it's the one that nearly blew the whole operation in its final moments. The strangest part is the guard wasn't responding to anything. No alarm had gone off. He just changed his pattern that night, for reasons the after-action briefing never pinned down. The team froze in covered position, roughly 15 meters from his new route, motionless for nearly 4 full minutes, while he passed within sight of their concealment. He didn't see them. Whether that was low light, camouflage discipline, or plain luck, the guard kept walking and moved out of the area. At 11:48 p.m., the team resumed their withdrawal toward the outer fence. Charges set. Team clear. What no one inside that compound understood yet was that the radar protecting Sevastopol's entire northern approach had less than 15 minutes of normal operation left. Detonation came at 12:01 a.m. Witnesses inside the fire control van described a low, contained explosion, not built to be heard from a distance, but to do precise damage to precise components. Within seconds, the radar's display screens in the control van went to static, then black. Russian operators reported total loss of target tracking, then a full system shutdown triggered by the radar's own internal safety protocols, reacting to the cooling failure. For the first 6 minutes after detonation, the Russians on site assumed a malfunction. Not sabotage, not an attack, a malfunction. That assumption bought the extraction team critical time. Most people assume an operation this sensitive would trigger an immediate base-wide alert the second something went wrong. It didn't. Russian command culture at fixed installations, far from the front, tends to default to mechanical failure as the first explanation, not infiltration. That blind spot is exactly what let the team clear the outer perimeter before anyone even considered an attack. By 12:14 a.m., roughly 13 minutes after detonation, the team had crossed back through the outer fence and was moving toward a pre-positioned extraction point nearly 6 kilometers away. Russian security, still working off the equipment failure theory, hadn't started a perimeter search. It wasn't until 12:40 a.m., nearly 40 minutes after the charges went off, that Russian command at the site upgraded the incident from a maintenance fault to a possible security breach. By then, the team had covered most of the distance to extraction. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because operations like this one aren't won with firepower. They're won with patience, timing, and the willingness to wait 3 frustrating months for a 6-minute window that might never come. What gets us about this case is how little of it depended on any technology that didn't already exist. No exotic new weapon disabled this radar. No breakthrough in electronic warfare. What did it was the oldest tool in special operations. A small group of trained people willing to wait, willing to walk, willing to accept that the margin for error was close to zero. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback. Russian commanders bear more responsibility for this failure than their own internal reports will ever admit. A battery this important, protecting the literal headquarters of what's left of the Black Sea Fleet, should never have had a predictable 6-minute gap in its security rotation for 3 consecutive months. That's not bad luck. That's institutional complacency, and it's the same complacency that's cost Russian forces all over this war. The assumption that distance from the front equals safety. By dawn the next day, Russian engineering teams arrived to assess the damage. Internal reports described it as catastrophic to the waveguide and cooling assembly. Damage Ukrainian intelligence assessments said would likely take weeks to fully repair, leaving a confirmed gap in radar coverage across a meaningful stretch of airspace approaching Sevastopol from the north and northeast. That gap mattered fast. Within 72 hours of the radar going dark, Ukrainian long-range strike planners reportedly adjusted target priorities to account for the reduced coverage, something confirmed indirectly through later satellite imagery, showing increased activity around other previously secondary Russian air defense assets being repositioned to compensate. What do you think? Did Russian command underestimate the threat from ground infiltration because they were too focused on drone and missile defense? Or was this just a security rotation that got complacent over time? We'd genuinely like to know your read. The strangest part of the whole operation might be this. Despite the scale of the damage, official Russian statements in the days after never acknowledged sabotage at all. Internal Ministry of Defense communications, parts of which later turned up in Ukrainian intelligence summaries, described the incident in language consistent with equipment failure, not enemy action. Whether that was to avoid embarrassment, avoid admitting a security failure to higher command, or both, isn't clear. There's a line in those internal communications that reads almost like fiction. A junior officer's report describes anomalous cooling system behavior consistent with manufacturing defect, filed less than an hour after the device had, in fact, been deliberately destroyed by a Ukrainian demolition charge. Whether that officer genuinely believed it or just found it safer to write, the after-action briefing doesn't say. Let's talk about what this operation actually cost on both sides, because the numbers tell their own story. Ukrainian losses: 0 casualties, 0 equipment lost beyond the charges expended, and a 4-man team extracted without contact. Russian losses: 1 S-400 acquisition and engagement radar, out of action for an estimated multi-week repair window, an undetermined but reportedly significant cost in replacement components, given how specialized the damaged systems are, and a confirmed gap in coverage across a critical axis, at a moment when Ukrainian long-range strike capability was expanding. Western-supplied capabilities didn't play a direct role in this particular strike, since it was entirely a ground infiltration mission. But the broader logic connects directly to the kind of long-range precision capability that Western systems, including extended-range rocket artillery and standoff cruise missile platforms, have given Ukraine over the past few years. A radar gap like this one isn't valuable on its own. It's valuable because it opens a corridor other systems can exploit. How many minutes elapsed between the team detonating the charges and Russian command escalating to a confirmed security breach? O. 12 minutes. B. 25 minutes. C. 40 minutes. Stick around, the answer's coming. If you think small, patient operations like this one move the strategic needle more than massive firepower ever could, type war vector in the comments. Back to the team itself for a second, because their training says something real about how Ukraine has adapted over the course of this war. None of these 4 operators started their careers as deep infiltration specialists. According to the briefing, the team reflects a now common pattern in Ukrainian special operations. Soldiers cross-trained across reconnaissance, demolitions, and small unit infiltration, built for missions where conventional force isn't an option, and patience matters more than firepower. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight, and this operation is a clear example. Against a layered, technically advanced air defense system, Russia treated as effectively immune to anything short of a missile strike, the answer wasn't a missile. It was 4 men, a demolition charge, and 3 months of watching a fence line. Real tactics, real consequences. War vector. There's another obstacle worth mentioning that the after-action briefing addressed only briefly, but that matters a lot for understanding how close this came to failing entirely. Roughly 6 weeks before the December insertion, an earlier infiltration attempt by a separate but related reconnaissance element, scouting an alternate route, was aborted after a weather system dropped visibility to near zero and made the team's planned thermal defeating route impossible to run safely. That abort pushed the whole operation back nearly a month, forcing planners to wait for the convoy delay pattern to show up again. A storm that looks like a footnote actually shaped the entire timeline. Without that delay, the team might have tried the original infiltration route, the one running directly past the newly built signals relay mast, weeks before that mast even existed in Ukrainian planning. In other words, the weather delay may have accidentally saved the operation from walking straight into a complication nobody could have seen coming. Sometimes the setback that feels like the worst possible outcome is the thing that prevents a bigger failure later. You can't plan for that. You can only recognize it afterward. What would NATO planners have done differently, facing the same layered air defense target? Comment your tactical read. We read every one of them. The team had control of their own extraction route by 1:15 a.m., roughly 75 minutes after the operation began. Vehicle pickup happened at a pre-arranged rally point outside the immediate security perimeter of the Sevastopol approaches, and the team moved through a series of staged transit points over the following hours, getting back to Ukrainian-controlled territory by the next evening. By the time Russian engineering teams finished their initial damage assessment, roughly 36 hours after the strike, the picture had already shifted. Ukrainian intelligence noted increased Russian air defense repositioning nearby. Additional Pantsir short-range systems moved closer to the damaged battery's footprint, apparently as a stopgap while the S-400 array was repaired. That repositioning thinned coverage elsewhere, a ripple effect that went well beyond the strike site itself. This is the part of modern warfare that doesn't make headlines the way a missile strike does, but matters just as much. A single low-casualty operation against one high-value node in an air defense network can force an opponent to redistribute resources across an entire region, weakening coverage everywhere else in the process. The S-400 near Sevastopol wasn't just one radar. It was a piece of a larger defensive system, and pulling it out, even temporarily, put stress on everything connected to it. Looking back, the real question isn't whether Russia could have prevented this specific operation. It's whether Russia's whole approach to rear area security across occupied Crimea was ever built to survive this kind of patient, low-signature infiltration in the first place. The evidence increasingly says it wasn't. By the time the Russian Ministry of Defense issued its limited public statements about technical maintenance at unspecified air defense facilities in Crimea, Ukrainian sources had already started quietly briefing the operation's broader outcome to Allied intelligence partners, framing it not as an isolated win, but as part of a sustained campaign to degrade Russia's southern air defense network ahead of intensifying long-range strikes. Would you have trusted a 6-minute security gap to hold for 3 straight months, if you were the officer responsible for that perimeter? It's easy to judge from the outside. It's harder to admit that complacency creeps in slowly, one uneventful night at a time, until the night it isn't. We cut one detail from this story for length, because the briefing treats it as unverified. Comment more below if you want to follow up on what happened to the relay mast detachment that nearly compromised the approach route. Back to the radar itself, because what was actually destroyed matters for understanding why this strike carried the weight it did. The 91N6E acquisition radar isn't a simple, easily replaced component. It's a purpose-built array requiring specialized manufacturing and, under wartime sanctions, components that have gotten increasingly hard for Russia's defense industry to source domestically. Ukrainian intelligence estimates suggested full restoration could run well past the initial weeks-long projection, given supply chain problems hitting several of the radar's critical subsystems. That's the deeper value of this operation. It wasn't just a temporary gap. It was damage to a system Russia couldn't just swap out overnight. In a war where Western sanctions have steadily eaten into Moscow's ability to replace high-end military electronics at the pace it once could. So, the quiz answer. How many minutes elapsed between detonation and Russian command escalating to a confirmed security breach? The answer is C, roughly 40 minutes. For nearly 2/3 of an hour, Russian personnel at one of their most important air defense sites believed they were dealing with a mechanical fault, while 4 Ukrainian operators were already most of the way to extraction. That gap between what actually happened and what Russian command believed was happening is in a lot of ways the whole lesson of this operation. Modern warfare doesn't always reward the side with the most firepower. It rewards the side that understands its opponent's assumptions well enough to exploit them. Was sending a 4-man ground team against a heavily defended, technically advanced air defense site really the right call, given how catastrophic it would have been if even one operator got caught? Could tighter Russian perimeter security, closing that recurring 6-minute gap, have prevented this entirely? And if you were planning this, knowing you had 3 frustrating months of dead-end surveillance behind you and a fragile, imperfect opportunity in front of you, would you have taken the shot or waited for something cleaner? Subscribe to War Vector. We break down the battles textbooks will study for decades, not the ones that make headlines for a day, but the ones that quietly reshape how wars are actually fought. The high ground above Sevastopol is quiet now. The radar array sits behind a reinforced perimeter. The rotation schedule's tightened. The relay mast still standing. But the wreckage remains. The cooling system, the waveguide assembly, the data junction, all damaged beyond field repair, on a night when 4 men walked further into Russian-held territory than anyone on that base thought possible. A quiet reminder that modern warfare punishes tactical complacency without mercy. Stay vigilant,